see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Artifact Live, where we look at the art and science of storytelling with me, Scott McArthur. How is everybody? Welcome to episode 41. Got the answer to life, the universe, and everything next week. But this week, we're looking at a really important part of storytelling, and one of the things that you should be thinking about if you're starting to craft a story, and that is the goals of your main characters. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but it's a really important show this week because it's one of the real building blocks of creating good stories, whether you're writing fiction, non-fiction, corporate stories, personal testimonials, whatever it is. The role of goals is somewhat significant. So thanks very much for tuning in last time. We had a lovely conversation about self-leadership, and I enjoyed it. And it was one of these discussions that was quite free-flowing, and it kind of proved the point that you don't always have to have a strict agenda, which is slightly in conflict with this week's goals thing. It slightly strikes me. But so I hope you enjoy this week as much. But thanks very much to Elizabeth last week because it was a super show. And if you haven't seen it, please, I'll put my YouTube channel up here for you. Please pop over to the YouTube channel and you'll see it's up there. It's at the top of the list. It's all about storytelling and self-leadership. Now, I had a funny thing happen to me this morning. And it kind of proves the point of this. One of the other things I'm really interested in, apart from storytelling, is music. And particularly over the last 20 years, I've been involved with keeping the memory of an old venue in Scotland going. It was called the Glasgow Apollo. And we've had an extraordinary story, the Glasgow Apollo story. One of these is I'm going to tell the whole story on here. Actually, I'll need to gather my thoughts and see if I can present it because I've never actually tried to present the whole thing on the vlog or the podcast so far. But I will do one of these days. But just this morning, someone put a picture up that really, really demonstrated to me the power of artifacts, and this was the picture. How many of you remember these? Now, one of the things that we talk about on the other show that I do on a Friday night is what we call rescued recordings. And there's a friend of mine called Jack who gathers these recordings for us. There's three of them. There's Jack, Stephen, and Phil. And they've now gathered over 300 recordings. A lot of them, maybe half of them, recorded on these things. Now, if you're not of a certain age, you won't even know what that is. It's an old tape recorder. And all you had to do to record something was whether you needed a mic knob to get better quality, but you plug in your mic to the back of this little recorder and you press the play button and that red button you can see there at the same time, and that will record whatever's going on. So they were really good, and people used to smuggle these are the size of a brick. People used to smuggle them in to venues and record concerts. And just when I saw it, I had all these memories flooded back, and it was lovely to see. I haven't got one. I think I might need to get one now. I've seen that because I think there's an artifact story in that, don't you think? Yeah, it was a lovely example. So thanks to the Glasgow Apollo Live group, who you'll see the hashtag there for all your memories and all the artifacts that you would not, well, you probably would believe the artifacts we've seen. It's been ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, to this week's show. If you're new here, and there are always new people joining us, kindly put your name in the chat and just say where you're tuning in from. If you're tuning in from my Facebook group, and again, I'll just stick up it's called the Empathy Engine, and I'll explain why it's called that later on in the show. Where is it? It is. If you're tuning in for the first time from there, and I know there's some new members have joined recently, if you'd be good enough to hit this little link here. Now it's actually in the group if you can't manage to click this on the screen here. But this chat.restream.io/FB, that'll mean your name will appear in the chat rather than it being Facebook person or Facebook member. It'll actually have your name in the chat, and I just like that. It's quite nice to see your name in the actual chat. So that's the admin. Let's get into this. And this is a subject that I've always been kind of aware of. It's become increasingly more important over the last probably 2 years for my work, in that I'm now telling more and more stories, and I'm setting off little ideas into audiences and online to try and get people to think about things in a slightly different way. So it's become more important to me. But I'd like you to think about goals. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily these can be included, but I'm not talking about the sort of the goal setting exercise you might do if you're doing a work-based thing, or maybe you've been with a life coach, or you've been talking about transformation programs. These goals, there's debates about the value of goals in that context, and it's a good debate, and it's one that maybe I'll have in another place, but not for this particular subject. But I'm going to talk about goals and storytelling. And there's a thing about goals that I think are really important, and in fact, they're probably pivotal to any character in any story. And it's the existence of goals in that individual that captures our imagination. It's the existence of goals that we can resonate with, we can feel empathy with. And that, I think, is a really important place to start if you're going to start thinking about writing stories. Now, there's a lot written in this subject, not so much in the world of storytelling, but what is written is mixed. But I like, there's a quote here, it's quite depressing, really. It says, "Most people aim at nothing in life and hit it with amazing accuracy." This is the sort of, the oil rig method of, running your life haphazardly without really thinking about where you want to get to. And whilst that is sometimes true in life, although a life lived in the moment can also be a very successful life. So it's not ubiquitous. But there's a way of thinking about it, I think, if you look at it in the storytelling, it makes it very, very different. And this is a quote from one of the great scriptwriters, one of the great TV and film scriptwriters, Aaron Sorkin, who you maybe know from the work on The West Wing. "Somebody's got to want something. Something's got to be standing in their way of getting it. You do that, and you have a scene." Now, Sorkin, I think, is extraordinary, and I've loved all of his work. I don't think yet he's had a few rough notes, but no bum notes in his career. But I adore The West Wing, etc. And I think I got this from his course on the Masterclass app, which I don't know if you've seen, folks. It's £100 a year where you get access to all these luminaries talking about how they became famous and how they were successful. It's a bit sort of narrow and a bit like sugar coating. It doesn't give you any depth, but nevertheless, it's £100 well spent. And actually, you get a free account as well when you join, so you can give it to a friend, which I did. So it's quite nice from that perspective. But I like this quote, and it starts to get us thinking about goals and what they're about, and why they're important when you're thinking about writing a story. And it doesn't matter what type of story, but today we're going to look at storytelling, mainly for you, just for you telling your stories. And I'll give you an idea here. This is a sort of, I'll gently get into this by giving you some definitions. So a goal is a specific destination or a result of an ambition. Meanwhile, ambition refers to the determination and process in reaching a specific goal. Now, I'm going to come back to ambition, but just before I do move on back and specifically into goals, ambition is the process, whereas the goal is the end product of that process. Also, without ambition, a goal cannot be fulfilled. Now, that's a sort of off-the-shelf definition. I don't think it's unhelpful. And if you think about it, in the background there, you can see Harry Potter. So in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Harry was, had all these experiences where he get dragged into love, relationship stuff. He got dragged into conflict with his best mate. There was entanglements with people. There was all sorts of secondary characters. However, it was always very, very clear that his main goal was to defeat Voldemort. I wonder if it should be Voldemort. because it sounds French to me. Anyway, his goal was always to defeat Voldemort. So regardless of the journey, the audience will be holding out to see whatever happens to that goal. So they no matter where he went, whatever diversion he went on, Harry was always brought back, or you as someone who was living through that character vicariously would be brought back to think about, when's he going to come back and when's he going to be fighting Voldemort again. So it's quite a way of dragging you into a story. And it's a bit like, whenever you hear let me just take this off, sorry. Whenever you hear in a story, now I'll be obvious, once upon a time, we know something is going to pop into our consciousness. We're going to have a character. Often the main character is called the protagonist, the sort of the hero, if you like, from the sort of post-Jungian hero's journey model, which I'm not always that sure about, but nevertheless, in this case, I think the hero is quite an interesting one. And you're invited to get to know that hero, and you're invited to identify them. And in fact, you could argue that you are the hero. You become that hero. You live. I mean, if you only have to watch your kids watching TV shows, and they jump about and they feel everything the character is going through. They feel it all inside themselves. So it's quite it's a powerful way that you experience a particular story. And I think that helps you become immersed. And what is specific about it is where you really get immersed is when the character has an active goal. That word, I didn't come up with that phrase, sorry. It was actually, I've mentioned this book before, and I think it's one of the better ones. It's John York's Into the Woods, and he talks about it being one of the sort of the pivots, the strong foundations of any protagonist is that they must have an active goal. And I think that's quite interesting. They sort of have a desire. So you're starting to feel the emotional resonance with that character if they have a goal. Because if they don't have a goal, well, it's very passive. And I actually can't think of a particular example. I'm sure there are movies in particular that you could maybe think of that the characters are so flimsy that they don't have goals. There's just, you can't relate to them, because if you don't know what they're trying to achieve, it's very difficult to relate to them. So that's the sort of, that active goal thing from York's work is where I think a lot of us have to start by to think about our stories. Now, I remember when I worked in the big bad consulting world, one of the things we used to do when I was running a team which was all about creativity and innovation and trying to engage the client, whether it was at the pitching level or whether it was at the delivery level. And we used to do what we'd create a straw man. We'd create the archetypal client, and then we would build our stories on that. Now that served the purpose 15 years ago. I think it's probably out of date now, because I think, like many things in that environment, you have to think about the individual rather than the straw man that represents the whole company that you're working with. You actually have to think about specifically who you're working with. And it's quite important in terms of getting the story right. And I'm going to tell a little story here that before I get into specifics about goals, I'm going to tell a little story about that, because one of the things I've used most in my career came from a relationship I had with my mentor, Jim. Now, those of you who have been here before will have heard many stories about Jim. I don't apologize for repeating these stories, but let me tell you this one. I was head of HR for Scottish and Newcastle, and we'd been having quite a difficult time. Beer brewing is not most of what you pay for your beer is tax, so the margins are actually very, very small, and we were struggling. However, one of the main ingredients of beer, the main ingredient of beer is actually water. And what happens with a lot of breweries, particularly older breweries, where they've not built with the future in mind, they were just built in the 19th century, because there was a space. And I used to base myself rather out of the Royal Brewery in Manchester, which is on the Princess Parkway, which is a bit like Beirut with the Times. It was a rough place, but it was okay. But that's where the brewery was, cheap land. We decided we were going to try and look for water underneath the factory. Now, what most folk don't know in Manchester, I don't think a lot of folk in Liverpool will appreciate this, is that the River Mersey actually is a little stream in Manchester. And when you get to where we were based, the water trickles out across the whole, underneath the whole of that area. So we drilled down and we hit the Mersey. We found water. And it was my job. The boss at the time was a very progressive guy, a lovely fella called Alan. And he said, look, what I'd like you to do is you be in charge of that, despite the fact you're the HR guy, Scott. I'd like you to take charge of this engineering project, which is one of the ways that he ran that team. And it's something that I've spoken about many times before, about shifting capabilities, about getting different perspectives. Anyway, my job was to get the money for this water tower to suck the water out of the ground, which would save us paying the council for their water. So it was really quite important. It would also save us things like to use tap water to make beer. The first thing you've got to do is take everything out of it because it's full of chlorine, etc. And the groundwater is also full of things, but it's slightly easier to deal with. So there was a whole range of reasons why it was good for us in terms of cash. So I had to pitch this to our boss, the big boss, if you like. Now, his name was Stephen, and he had the best job title of all time. He was Global Operations Director, God. And God was coming to see us, and I was in my office, which was a good-sized office. I was at the far end of my office, and there was a knock at the door. Stephen walked in. Now, in direct line of his sight, there was a picture of me when I used to have. I should have stuck it on here. Sorry, I forgot. But it's a picture of me with an Iron Mean t-shirt on, leather jacket, long hair, standing outside the football club that I support, Heart of Midlothian. And he saw it and he went, "Oh, you're a Hearts fan." And we started to talk about football. Turns out he was a Celtic fan. And I only had him. Now, God didn't visit very often. We only had him for 25 minutes. And after 20 minutes, I realised, it's too late to talk to him about the water. So I came out of that. Now I knew Steve. I mean, I knew him, so it wasn't like I had to create absolute resonance with him. But I'd spent half an hour chatting to him about football. If it had been the first time I'd met him, it would have been good because it would have created a relationship, a bit more of a stronger relationship. But it wasn't the first time I'd met him. Anyway, I went home that night and I said to my other half, I said, "Look, I've made a mistake here because Alan's going to expect me to have closed the deal on this. It was about 8 million quid. He's not going to be happy, and I really am feeling a bit nervous about getting to work tomorrow." Now, this boss of mine wasn't a guy, wasn't a bully. I'll tell you a story about bullying in a couple of weeks. But this guy wasn't. He was lovely, so there was no issue with dealing with this guy. But nevertheless, I was very nervous. And what she said was, "Look, I think you need to phone Jim." Now, Jim, if you're watching, Jim, hello. Jim's still a very good friend of mine. He's just moved house. I doubt he's watching. But Jim has been a mentor of mine for 20 years, has helped me through thick and thin. And at this time, we'd been working, I think it was just a year after I had left, working directly with Jim at a big fish company, a fish and general foods company. And I called him up and I said, "Look," and I told him the story. And he said, "Right." He said, "You plonker." And then he said, "There's something you need to do when you see God next." He said, "And that is, you need to polish your shoes." And of course, I like many of you, I'm sure you're thinking, what does that mean? And the first thing I thought, I looked down at my shoes, but that wasn't what he was talking about, obviously. And he said, "No, think about it, Scott." He said, "What should you have done before God arrived in your office?" And I said, "Well, I should have prepared better." And he said, "Well, did you prepare?" And I said, "Well, I did." He said, "But did you get?" I said, "No, I know, I didn't get to it. My fault. I got distracted, allowed myself to get distracted." He said, "Right. What you need to do is plan every single step the next time he comes, no pun intended, that by the time he gets into your office, he's starting to think about what you need from him." There was something quite lucky. The next morning I went in and the boss wasn't too impressed. When I told him, "Look, I've made a mistake. I didn't get to the point." And I told him the truth because he was a mate. It wasn't somebody I was scared of, or he wasn't too hierarchical, but he was a bit annoyed with me. He said, "Well, you're lucky, McArthur." He said, "Because God's coming back next week." So I went and did full-on Darren Brown on him. My HR business partner, Jo, who I think occasionally watches the show. So again, Jo, if you're here, nice to see you again. She's based in South Africa now, I think, but as an HR director. But anyway, so I said to her, "Right, we're going full-on Darren Brown." What do I mean by that? Well, it meant that everywhere that God went, he was going to see water towers. He was going to see the savings you can make from having a water tower of your own, rather than having the council water that you have to take all the chlorine out, etc. So from the minute he drove into the factory that next week, he stepped out of his car. On the windows we put posters about water and about how we could save money. We put a poster, there's a little lift up the 2 floors, and we put a little thing in there, just a picture, no words, just a picture. Then when he walked into my office, I had moved the picture, the football picture, from his line of sight, and I'd moved it over behind my actual desk. And what Jo had done was she'd taken the report that I'd never even got to it the previous week, and she'd highlighted all the little important parts about how this thing could save us an absolute, it was something like 9% of our costs. It was incredible. But where my picture had been of me at the football club was a flip chart, and on that flip chart I kind of made it up, but I drew a graph where it showed the increase in net profit that we could make if, and I'd written H2O in an arrow, and of course he saw it. Now, he never commented on it, but he walked into the room, he put his arm on there was a sort of filing cabinet, and on that filing cabinet there was the report. And what clever Jo had done was she had basically highlighted, you know those posters you get with the arrows? She'd written little bits on the report and the arrow, and he opened it up and she'd highlighted the key bits. She'd gone through the whole report like that. We had him. He sat down on the coffee table, which was right as you go in through the door. There was just me, him, and Jo. On the table, Jo, then what she'd done was she'd taken laminates of the key parts of it's back when I used to use PowerPoint, and she'd taken the key parts of that, and she had, put them on the desk. We had them in seconds. We got the money. Now, I remember years later, I very, very oddly, I met him at an airport in London, Heathrow, and I got chatting to him. We had a couple of beers, actually, because our flight was delayed. And I said to him, do you remember that time? And he went, yeah, I do. He said, yeah, you did well that day. You got, I think it was 8 million quid out of me or whatever. And he said, yeah. I said, do you remember what the room was like? And he kind of did. And he actually remembered the flip chart, but we'd never spoken about it. And he said, will you try to influence me that day? And I went, yeah, absolutely. So my goal that day was to influence God to give me the cash. And the first time I met God, I hadn't been so clear. I got distracted, I think, from that active goal. I'd got distracted. So true story. Jim, if you're there, you can tell them. Definitely a true story. And it's something that I've now used for many, many years when I've been working, whether in consulting or as a speaker. I've said to my team, I used to say to them when we were doing pitches, how are we going to polish our shoes? What we're going to do to win this work? And again, I've told many of these stories before. I won't go on and tell any more just now, but I hope you found that interesting. So just before we go on, there's a Facebook user. This is what happens if you don't have your name clicked on that little link. But hello, Facebook user. I think I might know who this is, but it may be apocryphal. But I heard that on a staff appraisal, the manager wrote, he sets very low standards, which he consistently fails to achieve. Yeah, that is a bit like the quote I used about, I'll just put it back up again if there's anyone coming in late. We used a little quote at the beginning, which was this. Most people aim at nothing in life and hit it with amazing accuracy. So I think that might be Doug there. So thanks, Doug, if it was you. If not, let me know who it was. So there's a couple of, I'm going to go back now and pull out from that little definition I gave you earlier about why goals, active goals in specific terms, is something you need to think about, to draw in your audience. It's almost like the character acts as one of my guests, Ewan, a few weeks ago said, and he's a very successful writer, and he said when he writes books, it's almost like sending little avatars of himself out into those scenarios. And I think that's a really nice word for it, an avatar. So you which is you in a different scenario. And I think that is quite powerful in terms of why goals are so important, because you're trying, let me just take this off the screen. You're trying to get people to actually come with you, to feel empathy for the character, to feel every up and down of that experience. But what about these goals? What are these goals like, and how can I help you with that? Well, let me have a go here. Let me just there's a couple of comments here. Someone thinks it was a Churchill quote. Yeah, it could be from his school report. Yeah, I think that might be Andy, actually, that one that I think it was Doug that said it earlier. I think you might be right. No, Doug's saying it's not me. I'm on LinkedIn today. Who are you over there on Facebook? Facebook user, let me know who you are. I'd like to give you a name check because it's a good point. Andy, I think you could be right. I think it could be a Churchill quote. But let me take you into this goal stuff a little bit deeper, because this is where we can start to get practical with this. Now, I've only done this 2 or 3 times on the show, despite the fact we're on our 41st episode. I've only ever really get into a very specific part of the story creation piece before, and there's a reason for that, because it's quite technical. But nevertheless, this is where I would like you to start thinking about creating your own stories. So the first thing I'd like to introduce you to, and again, I got this from the Masterclass app, specifically from Aaron Sorkin. He talks about having external and internal character goals. And what he says is that when he's writing, you have to establish what your protagonist wants. So what are they aiming at? What's the gun aimed at? What's the character aimed at? And you have to then think about, what their character desires. And then you've got to decide if these are internal or external goals. Now, it might sound a bit prosaic, this, but I can understand it, because I think he's trying to get us to think about detail at this point, because at the beginning of a story, that's when you get a chance to capture somebody. That's when you get a chance. And I think that's why this helps if you really, really go into the granularity of deciding whether it's an internal or an external goal. A character's goals are integral to their character, of course, and their character development, and play a big part in how they contribute to the story structure and flow. So if you're starting to think about your story, you start to think about, well, okay, what is his goals? What are her goals? What are their goals? Can we engage with them? Can we think about what these might mean? Let me give you a couple of examples. These are really obvious examples, but nevertheless, I think they're helpful. So you got like an external goal. This is the picture, a rather nice picture actually, of the Lord of the Rings. This was an artist who did this. He's trying to create the whole story in a picture. And I've forgotten his name. I had it in my mind, but I've forgotten. Never mind. I'll put it in the pack when I put it out. So this is an external goal, and that's one that kind of, how to best describe it? It kind of forces or motivates something outside that motivates the character themselves. So what happens is it could be something like an object they're searching for, like in the Lord of the Rings. They're trying to destroy something. It could be a destination like the Lord of the Rings. But the goal is external. It's an external conflict, and it's out there for everybody to see in the world. And it's the whole thing that keeps the character motivated right to the end. So in the Lord of the Rings, the protagonist's goal, Frodo's goal, is to chuck the ring into the fires of Mount Doom, to destroy the ring, the one ring, the all-powerful ring. And we know that whatever else happens to Frodo throughout that story, throughout the journey, ironically, that's his main specific goal. So that's what an external goal looks like. So it's something that's clearly outside of you. It's something that everybody else can see. It's something that is visible. And again, like what I said earlier about Harry Potter, even if there's a distraction, like a romantic moment, or there's a smaller conflict, the external goal is still the focus of that character. And if you're the viewer, casting yourself into that character, your avatar into that character, needs to be aware or will be aware rather, if it's a good active goal, that there's an ongoing story running right the way through the bigger picture. It's a bit like, I'm a big science fiction fan, and in one of my favorite science fiction series, Babylon 5, which I think is way superior to Star Trek, and certainly mega superior to Star Wars. The first 4 series are all about trying to get, it's actually based on the Lord of the Rings. So they're trying to get to what they call the Shadow War at the end of the 4th series. And each episode, despite each episode being an individual episode, which you could watch in isolation, a bit like Star Trek, there was always this overarching, this story arch about the shadows and trying to get to the end, to remove the shadows from the particular part of the universe that the characters lived in. So that's a sort of example that you might be familiar with. Then the next one, now this film, I loved it. It's called Wild. Now, not everyone has seen it. I think it's absolutely terrific, and it's a great example of how powerful, or how a goal can be internal rather than external. Because in an internal goal, the goals are sort of beneath the surface. They're not always clear, and they might never become clear. There's sometimes characters that you think, what on earth's the motivation? But it's that curiosity that you're happy to give your avatar to that story. You're curious about it. So the character's goal on the exterior could be to do something else. It could be to I don't know, become an MP. Say it's to become an MP. That they could state that as their goal. Say, I want to be an MP. But underlying that, they may have another goal, which may be to change Parliament, how it's structured. It could be, it could be to destroy Parliament. There could be all sorts of things underlying that. And that curiosity, certainly for me as a reader and for me as a listener and a watcher, is very, very attractive. I love this particular example I'm going to give you in a minute. But so therefore, having it underneath the surface gives it a level, I think, of sort of quality that's very difficult sometimes for some people to follow. And you remember, again, I'm sorry if I'm fully using sci-fi tropes today, sorry. But one of the awful examples of this was Blade Runner. Now, I love Blade Runner. It's one of my favorite movies. But the initial cinema release with the Harrison Ford voiceover, there was no need for it. They spoilt the movie because they had this voiceover. And very quickly, when they started to think about it, and they were getting feedback from the public, it wasn't a raging success. And I think no wonder, because of this voiceover. And they started to remove it, and it started to do much better. And it's now been a very successful movie, although it did take a lot longer than the cinema company had hoped. So the layers, the complexity of the character's life and personality can be hidden inside. Now, in the film Wild, the protagonist, she's called Cheryl. Funnily, she's called Cheryl Strayed. I'm sure that's deliberate. If not, it was a hell of a coincidence. But yeah, Cheryl Strayed. It is actually based on a true story, so it might just be a coincidence. She sets out to complete a massive walk. It's the Pacific Crest Trail. I think it was about 3,000 miles. It was crazy. And at the beginning, there's clearly stuff going on. You can see there's external stuff. There's tension. There's relationship problems. And you can start to see as the movie progresses that there's things going on in her mind that she's battling with. And it's trauma, it's being alone, it's depression. It's nearly the whole film is just her. And as the film goes on, we see more and more of these internal conflicts. She showed them, and they use a cinematic technique, flashbacks, to do that. But nevertheless, it's kind of like stepping back into the sort of the reasons that she's on the walk. And it's almost therapeutic, this part. Then it does a direct one. It's her mum dies, and her mum, the character, what's her name? Oh, I've forgotten her name. It doesn't matter. Her mum is also fighting against big relationship issues, violence. There's drug addiction, and it's all sort of, it's alluded to and it's hinted at as issues in Cheryl's mind as she's doing the walk. But then there's a part of it that I really love. There's a fox that Cheryl keeps seeing as she's walking the Pacific Crest Trail. And I think that is a reminder to the viewer. It's almost like another avatar, that there's an internal conflict following her all the way. And she thinks in a rather lovely, it's almost like an American Indian type of way, that this is an avatar for her mother and that her mother is with her on the trail. So that is a fantastic example, I think, of an internal goal. And how, when you watch that movie, I don't think it was hugely successful. I think people like it, but I don't think it was hugely successful. But nevertheless, when you watch that movie and you watch it over and over again, I personally became very invested in that character, and it didn't fall into the usual movie tropes where got sex involved, and none of that. There's none of that. There's hints, but there's none of it in the actual movie, and there is from our flashbacks, but not from the journey. And I got very, very drawn into that character, really, really drawn into that character. So that, as I say, is a terrific example of an internal goal, I believe. And at this point, we're just going to take a little bit of a diversion. I'm just going to check the chat first, and then I'm going to have a chat with you about something else briefly before we move on to the final part. Someone's saying, fantastic film, resonated with me and my Camino. I know it is. It's you, Pete. How you doing? Press the little thing, you numpty. I want your name in the show. This is my friend, comedian and former senior policeman, Peter Edge. And he talks here about there's lots of internal goals that weren't clear at the outset. Absolutely. Now you know who wrote the quote above. Yes, I do. Thanks, Pete. But yeah, it's a really interesting little story. And yeah, I think it was Laura Dern. I think you're absolutely right, who's the actress who played her mother, and it was a very powerful piece. Actually, I think she might have won a Best Supporting Actress, Laura Dern, for that. I mean, I think it did quite well at the Oscars, etc. So anyway, so I'm going to have a quick break just to remind you of something else that I'm doing now. Last month I had my first re-emergence, if you like, into the marketplace on Funzing. Now, Funzing is a platform that does all sorts of things, usually face-to-face events, but obviously at the moment doing a lot of virtual events. And last month I did my first storytelling at work event, and I have to say I was delighted with it. It went really, really well, and it was quite weird doing it. Well, one, getting paid for it, because I've done 300 hours of this and not got paid a penny. But one, getting paid for it, but two, people who had never attended one of my shows came along. Some did, but most of them hadn't, and it was lovely to get the responses that came back. So I'm doing another one. Now it might appeal to some of you, it might not. If you're a regular on the show, you might think, well, I hear Scott's voice once a week, that's enough. But if you are interested, pop over to the funzing.com website, just type in my name, and you'll see this course, Storytelling at Work, How to Stand Out in the Digital Crowd. See, because one of the things I really believe it is that stories can help you break through, can help you be different from everybody else. Because, when I was an HR director, it was easy because you would just look for the best person for the job. They'd have better qualifications, they'd have better experience, they'd have better resumes or CVs, they'd be better at everything. See, these days, everybody's got a degree. They're all coached on how to write CVs. They're all writing great covering letters. It's the stories that differentiate. So I guess this is aimed at people who are looking for a career progression, looking to get onto a career, maybe change career. So it's quite a specific one. It's not so much about the bigger picture of storytelling. I'm about to launch, I'll probably do it this afternoon, it might be tomorrow, another course on there called Core Consulting, which is an introduction to business consulting, which is a sort of recast version of what I've been doing every year at Birmingham University for the MBA students, where I give them a 2-hour introduction to the realities of business consulting. So I'll be doing that later on today. So if you're interested in that, please pop out to Funzing and you'll see it there. They're 12 quid or something. It's not expensive. So to remind you, this is Artefact Live, where we explore the art and science of storytelling. We're a vlog and soon to be a podcast, and my name is Scott McArthur. Now, I'm going to, for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to look at this word ambition, because it's something that, you often hear people talking about goals, but you don't so often hear them talking about ambition. So I would like to take you through it, lead you through some of this, which I think is quite cool. And actually, one of the pieces of feedback I got, wait a show, this nearly made me cry. This Graham, who's a regular on here, this was the feedback I got from Graham from my Funzing event. Come to the edge, we might fall. Come to the edge, it's too high. Come to the edge, and they came, and Scott pushed, and they flew. Dear, I loved it, because Graham's obviously heard me talking about the edge of next, which is one of my keynotes, and why I believe we're about to step into a new world. I think that's some of the, if Carlsberg did feedback, that would be the best feedback. But let's talk about ambition. Now, I'm going to do this. This won't surprise regulars at all. I'm going to use this technique that I love, and I think it's the most powerful and misunderstood form of literature, and that is poetry, to explain this. So remember right at the beginning, let me just put this slide back up again. I sort of gave you a definition of goals, and then I spoke about, the link between goals and ambition. So there's no point in having a goal if you're not ambitious enough to push it through, to deliver on that goal. But the poet David Whyte, who I think I've had on here about 4 times, or referred to his work 4 times. I'm hoping to have him on, actually. I have asked him. Fingers crossed. He writes these very short essays, and they appear on Sam Harris's app, Waking Up, which is a wonderful app if you're interested in meditation and thinking and storytelling and myth and science and philosophy. It's a great app. And David Whyte has been commissioned to do a whole part of the app. And part of that is to write these little essays. Now, I'm going to show you the one. There's a little bit. It's got a little video connected to it, but it's called Ambition. Now, unfortunately, with the system I'm using at the moment, Restream, it doesn't allow me to pause the video. So I'll switch it on and off. It remembers where I've switched it off, so it shouldn't be too clunky. I hope it works out. But let me just play this to you. It's about 5 or 6 minutes long, but we'll just break it up into little bits as we go through it. So this is David Whyte talking about ambition.
Ambition. Ambition is a word that lacks ambition. Ambition is frozen desire.
Ambition is a word that lacks ambition. Ambition is frozen desire. Ambition is frozen desire. What does that make you think? So if I've got a goal and I feel ambitious about getting to that goal, but that ambition is frozen desire, what do you think David's getting at there? What do you think? Just check and see if anyone actually saying anything. Not yet. So that's the first bit that I want you to think about. I'm not going to give you it because he goes into it, but I think it's a really powerful beginning to start thinking about
the current of a vocational life immobilized and over-concretized to set unforgiving goals. Ambition may be essential for the young.
So to set unforgiving goals, I think that is something that we've been hoodwinked by a lot of the, what would you call them? Personal, I don't like the name because it implies that they know what they're talking about, a lot of them, but the sort of personal improvement brigade, the Tony Robbins of this world, who push us to set these big, hairy, audacious goals. Now, I understand the logic, the sort of pop psychology behind it is that it's pop psychology, but the in my opinion anyway, but the big goal thing, what does it do to us? And I think this is what David is getting at. And I'll play it a bit longer this time so you can get into it. But I just wanted to set up with where I'm coming up with this before we play the rest of it.
But becomes the essential obstacle of any attempt at a mature life. Ambition abstracts us from the underlying elemental nature of the creative conversation, while providing us the cover of a target that becomes false through over-description, over-familiarity, or too much understanding.
Over-familiarity and too much understanding. Now that, I have seen that particularly in the corporate world where, you know, a company is so fixed on its goal to become the top provider in the market or the top service provider in the market that it loses sight of what it's actually trying to achieve, and that is good customer service and employee engagement. Nearly invariably, that's what everybody's about, certainly in the private sector. They spend hours working that out, and yet they're all the same. It's quite interesting, isn't it? But so that I like that. I think the idea that it can divert you from what you're actually trying to achieve. The avatar is diverted by too much ambition.
The ease of having an ambition is that it can be explained to others. The very dis-ease of ambition is that it can be so easily explained to others. What is worthy of a life's dedication does not want to be known by us in ways that diminish its actual sense of presence. Everything true to itself has its own secret language and an internal intentionality with a secret, surprising flow.
Now that resonates with me because I think that what he's trying to do there, and I haven't asked him about this, I will if I get a chance. I think what he's saying there, and David's often like this, he's ambiguous. I actually asked him once what he meant by a particular piece, and he said, I don't know. And he meant it, you know. But I think what he's doing there is he's asking us to think about, have a conversation in our head, if you like, about, is it an internal focus? Is it an external focus? What's the truth? Because companies, particularly, I'm sorry if I'm talking about companies all the time, but companies often have a stated goal. But the underlying goal, everybody kind of knows what it is, but they don't want to talk about it. And that, I think, leads to this dis-ease that David talked about, where companies say one thing, but actually are trying to do another. And I've seen it so many times in corporations where things like performance management are done purely as a money-giving exercise. You know, the bell curve type performance systems that these companies still have, which are awful, that don't work. And you know, all they're trying to do? All they're trying to do is actually distribute money in a way that seems fair. And oftentimes what they're trying to do is get rid of people. because their recruitment processes are so poor that they bring in the wrong people for the jobs and they don't perform, and then they don't know how to manage them out. That's the harsh reality of it. I'm a guy who worked 15 years as an HR director. That's the truth. But they never say that. But that is the underlying truth. And that leads to conflict, as David's about to talk about.
Even to the person who supposedly puts it all in motion. Ambition ultimately withers all secrets in its glare before those secrets have had time to come to life from within, and then thwarts the generosity and maturity that ripens the discourse of a lifetime's dedication to a work. We may direct the beam of ambition to illuminate a certain corner of the future world, but ultimately it can reveal to us only those dreams with which we have already become familiar. Ambition, left to itself, like a Rupert Murdoch, always becomes tedious. Its only object, the creation of larger and larger empires of control. But a true vocation calls us out beyond ourselves, breaks our heart in the process, and then humbles, simplifies, and enlightens us about the hidden core nature of the work that enticed us in the first place. We find that all along we had what we needed from the beginning, and that in the end we have returned to its essence, an essence we could not understand until we had undertaken the journey. No matter the self-conceited importance of our labors, we are all compost for worlds we cannot yet imagine. No matter the self-conceited importance of our labors, we are all compost for worlds we cannot yet imagine. Ambition takes us toward that horizon, but not over it. That line will always recede before our controlling hands. But a calling is a conversation between our physical bodies, our work, our intellects and imaginations, and a new world that is itself the territory we seek.
So he's talking here about a sophisticated type of goal, a different type of goal, a calling, which I see as a big thing, you know, changing the world, changing myself, you know, some you know, helping children, feeding kids, you know, the bigger side of things, my calling in life. It might be a spiritual thing you're thinking about.
A vocation always includes the specific, heart-rending way we will fail at our attempt to live our lives fully. A vocation always includes the specific, heart-rending way we will fail at our attempt to live our lives fully. A true vocation always metamorphoses both ambition and failure into compassion and understanding for others.
Well,
ambition takes willpower and a constant application of energy to stay on a perceived bearing. But a serious vocational calling demands a constant attention to the unknown gravitational field that surrounds us, and from which we recharge ourselves. As if breathing from the atmosphere of possibility itself. A life's work is not a series of stepping stones. A life's work is not a series of stepping stones onto which we calmly place our feet, but more like an ocean crossing, where there is no path, only a heading, a direction, in conversation with the elements.
I think that bit is particularly important. I think particularly young people are often tricked into thinking it is, you know that cartoon, you've seen it, you know, the project managers A to B. Here's how it works. Here's the reality. You know, that you've seen those pictures. There's dozens of them. It's an archetype. It's a story archetype. And I think that, for me, probably for the whole of this piece, is the most important part. But let me just put David back on, because I think...
Back, we see the wake we have left as only a brief, glimmering trace on the waters. Ambition is natural to the first steps of youth, who must experience its essential falsity to know the larger reality that stands behind it. But held on to too long, and especially in eldership, it always comes to lack surprise, turns the last years of the ambitious into a second childhood, and makes the once successful into an object of pity. The authentic watermark running through the background of a life's work is an arrival at generosity. And as a mark of that generosity, delight in the hopes of the young, and the giving away to them, not only of rewards that may have been earned, but the reward in the secret itself, the core artistry that made the journey a journey. Perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave from our work is not to instill ambition in others, though this may be the first way we describe its arrival in our life, but the passing on of a sense of sheer privilege, of having found a road, a way to follow, and then having been allowed to walk it, often with others, with all its difficulties and minor triumphs, the underlying primary gift of having been a full participant in the conversation. Perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave from our work is not to instill ambition in others, though this may be the first way its arrival in their life is described, but the passing on of a sense of sheer privilege, of having found a road, a way to follow, and then having been allowed to walk it, often with others, with all its difficulties and minor triumphs, the underlying primary gift of having been a full participant in the conversation. Ambition.
Well, David's voice is not only hypnotic, but I think it often grabs me and I go off. You know, it's a bit like Alan Watts. He's the other one who's got one of these voices that when you listen to them, they just take you. And I hope you enjoyed that. I'm sorry I interrupted it a few times. Maybe I should have waited to the end. I think I know how to do this by now, but I just wanted to try and signpost it a little bit. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I think and it'd be interesting to hear what you think, and perhaps if you get a chance in the, maybe not now, have a think about it. But if you watch that again, or comment on the Facebook groups or on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, whatever. There's a lot of people on Twitter today. I wonder why that is. Hello, and thank you for tuning in. There's a lot of you. Thank you. I'd like to know what you think, what David was trying to get at there. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's packed, and it's why it really needs an hour now to go through almost every line, because it's there was one line that I'm just going to read. It says, a true vocation always metamorphoses both ambition and failure into compassion and the understanding of others. Wow. I mean, do I understand that completely? No, I don't. Am I fascinated by it? Yes, I am. So, folks, that is it. That's an introduction, just an introduction to why goals are so important and a key part of the storytelling, and how those goals, that avatar, that protagonist with those active goals, as York says, these active goals, is so important for you to be invested in that character, to live through that character, to be interested in what happens to that character, and to actually want to be associated with that character. Because remember, you see, in the very practical side of this is that facts tell, but stories sell. And interesting, that's going to be the big theme next week, where I've got Professor Rob Binder coming on. Sorry, Rob, who is very much an advocate of the facts part and has been quite vociferous about some of the issues with storytelling. And I share those issues. So we're going to have an interesting chat. I don't think we're going to fall out, but we're certainly coming at it from similar outcomes, but maybe from slightly different angles. So it might be interesting for you to tune in next week and hear that. So I hope you enjoyed that. I loved just being on my own for a change. It was nice just talking to you for an hour on the end of this Logitech camera. So that was good. Now remember, and I say that for those of you who don't tune in regularly, this is something I say every week. And I say it because I believe it. I believe that I really hope this week is the week when you spot a story, hopefully one of your own stories, be an archaeologist of your own life, as I always say, and because you know what, that story could change the world. It really could. And there's loads of evidence that happens. So let me just check the text. Peter saying, you've done the little thing, Peter. Thank you very much. It's working. Interesting stuff as always, Scott. Thank you very much, Peter. That was a pleasure having you on the show again as a guest. That's great. Right. So next week, as I said, we've got Rob when we're looking at evidence storytelling. It's about a completely different tone, completely different show. I hope you enjoyed that. I loved it. And we're now working towards the 50th show. But next week is all about life, the universe, and everything. My name is Scott McArthur. Thanks for tuning in to Artefact Live, where we explore the art and science of storytelling. See you next week.